Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary Immerman, and I'm an executive board member of Australian Friends of Rambam. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to begin proceedings tonight with Australian Friends of Rambam acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. On behalf of the board of the Australian Friends of Rambam, I would like to welcome you all to the session tonight. Tonight's topic is certainly a very interesting one and very much on point in today's world, especially with many of us on this call tonight currently being in lockdown. We'd like to express our gratitude to our great speakers tonight, who will be introduced shortly, as well as our partners, the Israeli Embassy in Australia, Zionism Victoria, with a particular thanks to Charlene, the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, with special thanks to Michelle Bloom and Cara, and to Rambam Healthcare Campus, with special thanks to Inbar Shahaf. I would also like to acknowledge Mr. Ron Gerstenfeld, Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Israel in Canberra, who's with us tonight, and also to acknowledge the many members of the Diplomatic Corps and members of Parliament that have joined us tonight. Before we start, a few words about Rambam Healthcare Campus and Australian Friends of Rambam's work. Rambam Healthcare Campus is a 1,000-bed working-class teaching hospital based in Haifa. The patient population is diverse, as Rambam is a major referral medical center for all of northern Israel, serving more than 2 million residents and other patients being referred from all over Israel, the Mediterranean region, and from all around the world. Rambam is respected internationally for its clinical services and its innovation in medical technology. Many of you would have heard of the underground emergency hospital at Rambam, which was founded in response to lessons learned during the Second Lebanon War to ensure the protection of its patients and medical workers. Today, this building has been transformed from a parking garage into the largest COVID-19 treatment center in the country in order to fulfill the rising national demand for extra dedicated treatment space. The Australian Friends of Rambam charity and its Circle of Health program is linked to Rambam Healthcare by bringing the cutting edge technologies and information that helps thousands of people in Australia. To improve health in our community in Australia, we have conducted a range of health and wellness activities such as lectures, events, and webinars, utilizing local expertise and strengthening global collaboration with world-renowned facilities in conjunction with experts based at Rambam. We have also facilitated flagship research collaboration between Rambam and medical research institutions here in Australia. And now, with no further ado, please welcome Mr. Yossi Goldfarb, President of Zionism Victoria.
Thanks, Gary. We're at Zionism Victoria really excited to have the opportunity to partner with Rambam and with the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce and, of course, with the Embassy of Israel to bring you this event. The mission of Zionism Victoria is to connect Israel with Victoria and Victoria with Israel. And I can think of no more exciting or timely opportunity to do that than tonight's discussion, where we can all see where Israel's cutting edge work on COVID and see how lessons can be learned for our experiences here in Australia. With close to 300 people, or just over 300 people registering for tonight's forum, we know that there's strong interest in the topic, and we're particularly pleased, as Gary mentioned, to be hosting some dignitaries from both the Diplomatic Corps and several parliaments across the country, whom I'd like to acknowledge. Now, I'd like to acknowledge Rania Makouris from the Egyptian Embassy, Marie Claire Monti from the Mauritian High Commission, and also I understand a representative from the Embassy of Japan. From the Federal Parliament, we've got Senator David Fawcett, Senator Don Farrell, Katie Allen, Mark Dreyfus, Maria Van Kimu, and Josh Burns. From the Victorian Parliament, we have Vicky Ward, Neil Angus, Cindy McLeish, and Walt Secord from the New South Wales Parliament. In addition to the other 300 or so guests, you're all very welcome, and I'm sure we will be in for a most informative evening. I'd like to now introduce Michelle Bloom, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, and she will introduce tonight's moderator to us.
Acknowledge the traditional owners of the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from today, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. The Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce is an organisation whose purpose is to build collaboration between Australia and Israel in a range of areas for the benefit of both countries. And so we're really delighted tonight to be partnering today with the Australian Friends of with Zionism Victoria to bring together this really important virtual forum tonight. And I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us tonight, and thank you for taking the time to be with us for this important conversation. The AICC, through our very large program of business events and in non-COVID times, our trade missions to Israel, exposes Australian businesses, governments and academic leaders to many areas of innovation in Israel. And in recent years, we've had a very strong focus on healthcare innovation and have been thrilled to facilitate many Australia-Israel partnerships in this area, including through the creation of the Garvin Weitzman Centre for Cellular Genomics in Darlinghurst, and between the New South Wales Government and the Israeli Ministry of Health. Prior to COVID, many of our Australian healthcare delegations visited Rambam Healthcare Campus and its very exciting Mind Up incubator. And I cannot wait until we can visit Rambam again when borders reopen. In the meanwhile, we're really delighted to have supported this virtual meeting today between some of Australia and Israel's leading healthcare experts in this very exciting and very, very timely conversation on very innovative new COVID therapies being developed at Rambam. So I'm pleased now to hand over to Vered Harel, our host for tonight.
Thank you. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Vered and I'm from the Board of Australian Friends of Rambam. Would you please welcome our moderator for tonight's webinar, Mr. Adir Shiffman. Adir is an Australian serial tech startup founder, investor and executive chairman of global athlete analytics leader Catapult Sports. He has been rated the world's 10th most innovative person in sports business. After qualifying in medicine and practicing as an MD, Adir made the switch across to startup founder, and over the last decade launched, built, and sold more than 1,000 high-growth tech companies. Adir also writes a column each Tuesday in the Australian Financial Review. Adir, to you.
Hello. Thank you, Vered. We've got a very special panel tonight. This is, in my view, the most interesting panel that I've been a part of through the whole of this pandemic. We have speakers who are experts in epidemiology and infectious diseases and internal medicine. And we have people both in Australia and also in Israel, which certainly has been seen globally as at the cutting edge of COVID management and treatment. And so I'm really very much looking forward to it. Let me give you a quick introduction of the people who we've been lucky enough to attract onto the panel tonight. So let me start with Professor Tony Hayek, who is at the Department of Internal Medicine E at Rambam Healthcare Campus. Professor Hayek graduated from the Faculty of Medicine at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and completed his residency in internal medicine at the Rambam Medical Center. He also undertook a 2-year residency conducting research at the Rockefeller University in New York. In 1999, Professor Hayek was appointed the head of the Emergency Room and Internal Medicine E Department, and since then has served as the acting head of the Department of Internal Medicine E. He's leading his department to the designation as a chest pain unit, providing fast and comprehensive cardiac investigations, the first of its kind in the country. Under Professor Hayek's guidance, a number of clinical multi-center studies are being carried out, mostly in the field of cardiovascular and hyperlipidemia. So welcome, Professor Hayek. It's wonderful to have you here. We also have another professor, Professor Mary-Louise McLaws, who is the Professor of Epidemiology, Hospital Infection and Infectious Diseases Control at the University of New South Wales. Mary-Louise also has the distinction of one of the longest titles that I'm about to read, so bear with me on this. So Mary-Louise is an epidemiologist and with expertise in hospital infection and infectious diseases control. Her COVID-related activities include, and this is impressive, a member of the World Health Organization Health Emergency Program Experts Advisory Panel for Infectious Diseases Control and Preparedness, Readiness and Response to COVID-19. So that doesn't fit on one business card, I'm sure. She's also a member of the New South Wales Clinical Excellence Commission COVID Infection Prevention and Control Task Force. She's the focal point for the WHO Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network in the School of Population Health. So thank you for joining us tonight, ML. I think I got through that okay. Take a few breaths now. From Rambam, we have Dr. Shadi Hamoud, who is the Deputy Director, Department of Internal Medicine at Rambam Healthcare Campus. He's an experienced senior physician skilled in clinical research, medical education, pediatrics, general medicine, and clinical trials. He has a Doctor of Medicine focused on internal medicine residency program from the Hebrew University. And a little bit later, Dr. Hamoud is the very special person that's going to share with us some of the most exciting research currently being undertaken in the treatment of COVID-19, and we'll get to that shortly. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Hamoud. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Michelle Ananda-rajah, who is an infectious diseases and general physician at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. Dr. Ananda-rajah, as I said, is at the Alfred. She has a particular interest in artificial intelligence and health services research. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Michelle co-founded Healthcare Workers Australia, a grassroots advocacy movement dedicated to improving the occupational safety of healthcare workers. She has been published on topics including work, health and safety issues for healthcare workers, has made numerous media appearances including on the ABC's Q&A in Four Corners, and has written for the Australian newspaper. And because she didn't have enough to do, in 2021, Michelle was announced as the Labor candidate for Higgins. So thank you for joining us, Michelle, as well. And I might start with this question, and I might start with you, Mary-Louise, or ML, I'm going to call you. How would you characterize the current circumstances or situation of COVID-19 in Australia right now? What would be your brief characterization of that?
Brief characterization is we may never see zero again. So for those in Israel, we had effectively kept to zero for quite some time. We occasionally had small outbreaks, but Delta occurred and we waited too late to shut down. You have to shut down as soon as you have one case of Delta in the community. We now have 15,880 cases in New South Wales alone and 80 deaths, and 3 of those have occurred at home in young people, 2 in 30 and 1 in his 20s. And in Victoria, where Michelle is, there's over 830 cases. I think that's a bit more since today. We have inadvertently sent Delta to Victoria, ACT, Canberra, Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, and our neighbours, New Zealand. So right now, most of Greater Sydney is in lockdown, and we have what's called hotspots. We have some hotspots that have different restrictions than we do in other hotspots, which is quite concerning because people get a little confused. Our hospitals, as Michelle will tell you, some of them are overrun with just the enormity of having a lot of admissions across the 20-year-olds to over 60 and the occasional child. So I don't think we'll be seeing zero, and I'm hoping that we will start to improve our vaccine rollout, particularly to 12-year-olds and over, because we do have the TGA approval for 12-year-olds, but we haven't been injecting them. So if that gives you some idea, it's a bit gloomy. I had predicted we'd get to 1,000 cases a day by the end of the month, and sadly it happened today in New South Wales. So it's come 5 days earlier. So we're not in a healthy space from an Australian perspective.
Okay, and Dr. Michelle Ananda-rajah, Michelle, you know, from a clinical point of view, you know, are you seeing much presentation at the Alfred at the moment of COVID? And if so, like, what is that looking like at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Adir, and thank you for the invitation, Behrad and everyone. So I had a chat to my colleagues at the Alfred yesterday. I spoke to one of the intensivists, and their comment was basically that they're seeing younger people sent to hospital now, and they're deteriorating very fast, and they're ending up on ventilators. So, you know, I can't give you obviously details of those sorts of patients, but it's definitely worse than the previous wave last year. There's no question about that, and it's affecting younger people. And I guess that's probably because our older population are now basically vaccinated, and many of them have been shielding. You know, they've been staying indoors. They've really not been getting out very much, whereas our younger people are essential workers, and they are mobile and, you know, mixing and going to work, basically.
Okay, and so before I ask a question and throw over to Professor Hayek, I just quickly remind people to mute if you're not speaking. And also, there's a Q&A section, and I noticed that people are very enthusiastic and the Q&A already piling up. So please feel free to put your questions in there, and I'll weave them into the conversation as they come through. And so, Professor Hayek, you know, what we've heard is, you know, Australia at the moment is running at, let's say, ballpark, 1,000 cases a day, 1 to 3 deaths a day. Israel at the moment, Israel itself is running at probably 7,000 to 8,000 cases a day and 15 to 25 deaths, although it did peak at 55. But I want you to start off by taking us back to before Israel had 50% of the population with at least a double vaccination. What were you seeing in Rambam at that time, you know, from a hospital point of view?
So, good evening for everybody. Thank you once more for invitation to this webinar. Actually, in the beginning of this year, we have, as you said, the underground hospital, and we have like it was maximum of 10,000 patients every day. And we prepared the underground hospital for about hundreds of patients to come. But fortunately, we have like 120 patients every day in 4 departments. One of those departments is mine and Dr. Shadi, that was transferred from internal medicine department to be a COVID department. And at that time, we gave, of course, the regular standard therapy of steroids, remdesivir, and other supportive treatment. We have patients that were transferred to the intensive care unit. We have many patients with mechanical ventilation, and we have many mortalities at that time. After the vaccination, the second vaccination that Israel started with the vaccinations actually, and we have seen like improvements in every point, like the number of patients which has COVID like dropped to around hundreds instead of thousands. The patients who were admitted to Rambam, the patients number went down to like at the end of the vaccination to around 20. Actually, we came to 0 patients in Rambam in the beginning of this summer, and which was very good. And actually, as you know, in Israel, around 1 million of the population, which is around 9 or 10 million, are not vaccinated. And still we have 0 patients in Israel in that period, and we were very happy till the variant come. And actually the patient number increased gradually in the last few weeks. And today we have not 7,000, we have 10,000 patients every day in the country. This is right till last night. And but we can say that patients that are coming to hospital, at least in Rambam, we have now around, we don't have the underground hospital, but we have 1 department which is only for corona patients, and 2 to 3 departments, internal medicine departments, which are, part of them are departments for COVID. What we can say that there are patients in the intensive care unit, and there are patients with mechanical ventilation, about 13 patients. And as we talked yesterday, the patients with severe situation, we have, of course, patients who were vaccinated twice or even third-time vaccination that were admitted to the hospital. But we can say for sure that patients that were vaccinated, the disease in the hospital was much better, like they did better. They were not severe situations with patients who had vaccinations in the past, even though the antibodies were lower. And we can say that the intensive care unit, like 80% of the patients are those who are not vaccinated for different reasons. So if I can do summary, like meanwhile, we can say that the vaccination worked very well, the second vaccination. And unfortunately, when the disease came back, we had patients who are admitted from both vaccinated and unvaccinated, but the vaccinated patients did much better than the unvaccinated patient, even though the antibodies for COVID were lower. Still, there is a cellular immunity. And of course, we did many researches when we were in that department, and we are continuing with that with Dr. Shadi, who will present later on at least 2 studies. One of them, the missing cure study, which is very interesting, and he will talk about that later on, of course.
And just as a follow-up question to that, Professor, what are you seeing with respect to the ages of patients now with the Delta strain compared to in hospital with mild, severe, and ventilated disease compared to what you were seeing previously with COVID?
Regarding that, it's actually still patients who had more severe disease. These usually are patients with background diseases, and usually are the most patients that are admitted to the hospital. Of course, we don't admit everybody that come to the ER for COVID, but patients who are over the age of 60 had more severe diseases. But on the other hand, we can say that we know about young patients that had the disease, and even we had mortalities of the age of less than 30 in the last few days. So it's actually in all the spectrum, all the ages.
I mean, that's terrible to hear, and certainly that is consistent with some of the experiences in Australia that we're having.
I'm sure it's like Australia, actually, all over the world, it's the same.
Yeah. That, obviously the challenge in Australia right now is, and we'll come and talk about this shortly, but Israel is currently experiencing the positive impact potentially of the 3rd booster injection, whereas Australia is still racing to try to get to 2 vaccinations. But before we talk, in detail about the vaccination, I think actually, it's a good time to not solely talk about vaccination, but also to talk about treatment, because the dialogue mostly about COVID has been about how to vaccinate our way out of disease. And certainly that's the primary, most fundamental way to open up society as much as possible. But there's also been some very encouraging developments in terms of the treatment of COVID-19, particularly in hospitalized patients. And I know, Dr. Hamoud, you've been heavily involved with this, in particular with the drug called Mesencure, which is a mesenchymal stromal cell drug. And Rambam Hospital has been at the forefront of this treatment. And you've passed through phase 1 and I guess the beginning of phase 2 trials. And it's a very optimistic trial, because it's effectively treating patients with COVID-19 in hospital. And in fact, the Minister of Health just approved a trial that is a multi-center trial in Israel. And so, I know you've got some slides to take us through and talk us through for a few minutes, and people would be very interested to see, because, in Australia, the conversation has not at all been about, in the public sphere, the effective treatment of patients with COVID-19. It's predominantly been about vaccination. I think this will be very fascinating to people. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Dr. Hamoud.
Yeah. Good evening and good afternoon for everybody. Thank you for this interesting webinar. I will share with you 2 presentations shortly, and I hope you will see, and I will begin with the results of the treatment that we give patients, so you have the impression for what we have done. What's this? You see it now?
We can see lung films.
Yes, exactly. So in the left side of the screen, you can see the X-ray of a female patient, of a male patient, which was admitted with severe COVID and was treated with the regular of care treatment, of course, that patients receive, like Professor Hayek have explained before, which is steroids and remdesivir and Clexane, and of course supportive ventilation with nasal oxygen, or with high flow oxygen. And with our preparation, with our product that was given for this patient, we recruited patients which were only with severe disease, with O2 saturation of 93 or less, 93% or less. And the left side of the screen is the X-ray at the beginning of the study. The right one is 1 month later. We see that on the left side, there were an infiltrative disease that involved all the lung fields of both lungs. And after 1 month, we have almost normal lungs with no signs or no remnants of the disease that was at the time of their illness. This is another one. The first, on the X-ray on the left, it's a patient, male patient with severe disease, 59 years old, with bilateral infiltrates involving all the lung fields. And 1 month later, his lungs were almost clear at all. This is one more impressive X-rays for a patient, female patient, which was 69 years old. Of course, they all were severe patients with background diseases, mostly hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. And 1 month after treating them with our study product, they have clear lungs. And this is the last one, a patient which came yesterday, 1 month after she received the medication. And once again, we see on the left that the X-ray at the disease, at the time of the disease, when she was hospitalized in our department. And the right one, we see clear lung fields with no remnants and no other sequelae of the disease at the time of hospitalization.
So, Dr. Hamoud, just to kind of rephrase that, in layperson's terms slightly. So these are all patients that have come into hospital with COVID-19. Mostly they've got comorbidities, typically high blood pressure or diabetes, but they all have severe lung disease. You've treated them with the drug in your trial, Mesencure, and a month later, they are largely, the ones that you've shown, these 4 patients, largely have clear lung fields and have recovered their lung function. So that's that's an unbelievably remarkable outcome that has been achieved in that trial at Rambam.
Yes, so I just want to talk a few minutes about the product and maybe later to answer your questions, so it will be much more clear, I think. We, as Professor Hayek has explained before, our corona specialized department was started to work almost 1 year ago, and we had an average something like 30 patients every day that we treated with. In the department, there were almost 60 to 70% of the patients with severe disease, when the definition of severe disease includes clinical, laboratory, and X-ray findings or radiologic findings, which could be by X-ray or by tomography. So the clinical disease, of course, was mainly respiratory symptoms with blood pressure values or with heart rate, which was accelerated, with high temperature. And the laboratory findings included high levels of CRP, of C-reactive protein, which reflects an aggressive or an active inflammatory process. We saw mainly lymphopenia in the complete blood count. It's a decrease in some kind of the white blood cells. And we saw also a high level of D-dimer. D-dimer, it's some protein which is elevated when there is a vascular injury in the body. So we know that COVID can make a multi-system disease, and the basis for this disease, the mechanistic pathway is, of course, both components or both mechanisms by which it causes the multi-system disease. The first one is the inflammatory process that can attack all the body systems and organs. And the second pathway is endothelial injury. Endothelium is the internal layer of the blood vessels. And endothelial injury can cause a severe disease in all the body organs. And this is a characteristic finding that we saw in patients with COVID. And of course, the more aggressive or the more advanced disease is accompanied with more aggressive or more higher level of the inflammatory cytokines, with the inflammatory markers, with the endothelial marker, and of course, by lower oxygen and by higher involvement of lung fields in the X-rays.
And so Dr. Hamoud, so if I can just stop you for 1 sec again, just to recap. So, you know, it doesn't really, the detail for people that are non-medical, it doesn't really matter what mesenchymal stromal cells are, except to know that these are naturally occurring in the body and they help reduce inflammation naturally. And you found a way to use those and to activate them or professionalize them in a way that they become more effective. And before we hear more about the mechanism from you, I thought I just might throw to Michelle and say, you know, these mesenchymal stromal cells and this kind of these trial treatments, have you seen any of this in Australia at the Alfred or elsewhere?
No, not at all. We've not seen any of these sorts of really biological type therapies. We are using more conventional drugs, antiviral drugs quite commonly, and monoclonal antibodies to some degree. There's one that's just been approved yesterday actually. But no, this would be very, very novel.
And just one note, Adir,
yes.
Shadi will talk about that later on, because there was in the chat one of the questions, if this, what happened to the patients who didn't get the drug. So this study was performed in the beginning to show the safety of this new novel drug. And it was very, very safe. Shadi will show the results. But we have very, very good results really, but still we don't have, it was phase 1. We don't still have the double-blind study to show patients. Of course, this was a treatment on top of the standard therapy. So all the patients are getting standard therapy, and this was a treatment which was on the top of standard therapy. But still, we don't have like two groups, one placebo and one mesenchymal. This will come later on, because that was one of the questions. And this
yes,
is
absolutely. So that's a great point. So this is, you know, really this was just obviously medicine and scientific protocol is very structured, and the first step is to make sure that any potential new therapy is not going to injure or kill the patients. And so this is a phase 1 trial, and that's all you were testing.
Exactly.
And finding this degree of efficacy. That was not the objective of this particular trial. And so one of the next stages is to test what happens if we give the mesenchymal versus something else where nobody knows which one you're giving. So it can't bias how people understand the outcomes.
Exactly.
So
compared to placebo on top of standard therapy, of course.
That's right. And so, you know, Mary-Louise, just to throw to you as well. So, you know, have you know, this is not your first pandemic. It's not your first time around the block. I think you told me this is number 4 for you. And so, you know, the speed of starting to test these kinds of novel therapies, has this been unique to COVID-19 in your experience relative to the other pandemics that you've experienced? I'm hesitant to say this because you're going to hate me, but you're on mute.
Thank you. Somebody had to do it. So my first pandemic was HIV, and it was a very, very, very long time before there was any drug trials. And then when there were drug trials, they were often given to people who had very low T cell counts, CD4 counts, because they were given to on a compassionate ground. So randomized control trials didn't really start for quite some time into the pandemic in Australia and around the world. And then, of course, it took a long time to be able to find a drug that would keep people alive. And, you know, you'd have to take it every 4 hours. And that really impacted people's lives and how they saw themselves as well. Every 4 hours, they remembered they had a life-threatening disease. It was very tough. During SARS 2003, as Dr. Tony and Dr. Shadi would remember, in Hong Kong, they were giving all sorts of anti-inflammatories, and Michelle, we didn't really have any SARS patients here, but in Hong Kong they were giving anti-inflammatories, and I'm sure that Dr. Shadi will remind the listeners here that many of those people had really long-term ill effects because it was given on a very much an experimental level, because they had nothing to give them. They were just pushing in anti-inflammatories at any level. So I think we've come a very long way. At WHO, we have meetings. Mainly, I'm related to, yes, dexamethasone as well, yes. But you know, sometimes they gave too much too frequently, and there was a lot of people survived SARS but had long-term ill effects. And then, of course, at WHO, we were told a lot of information about some fantastic new vaccines, but there was often meetings where we were told about different drugs, and we were all getting very excited, and then, you know, the next time we had a meeting, it was forget about this one, it doesn't work. So it's really great to hear that there's some very exciting early phase information about this from Israel, and I think it would make a very big difference, particularly to Delta. I don't know, Dr. Shadi and Dr. Tony, whether you're experiencing a much bigger hospitalization this time around than the previous strains, but in the UK, you know, hospitalization is twice as common as Alpha, and those that present at ED have more respiratory distress. So this new drug that you're you know, working on will have, I think, a potentially an important role for that issue. And I wonder, Michelle, how many of those that have died who are very young at home, we don't know about their comorbidities, about whether or not they had, you know, respiratory distress, and they just, you know, had rapid deterioration. Yeah, I'm very excited about the potential.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, ML, because, you know, like effectively, the messenger is, you know, effective for acute respiratory distress, and there's been, you know, this fantastic research that Dr. Hamoud is talking about. And, you know, Dr. Hamoud, like, what are the next steps from here with this trial? I mean, it's been quite efficacious without being really a complete phase 2 trial. You know, I think I read that many of the patients typically were leaving within 1 day of the end of treatment with this treatment. What are the next steps from here in Israel for this?
Okay, we have just completed phase 1 study, which is part of the study that is more oriented for safety purposes. We saw that the product is much safe. We had only 1 fatality out of 20 patients for a patient which was almost 80 years old, and he had a very severe chronic obstructive lung disease with interstitial lung involvement after occupational exposure. And unfortunately, this patient came late to the hospital after more than 2 weeks of the start of his illness, and he was on mechanical ventilation at the same day. He was recruited for the study, and unfortunately, he didn't survive the disease. But all the other patients, they all were more than 60 years old on average in their age. They all had severe disease. They all needed respiratory support with oxygen. Most of them needed high flow therapy, either on Vapotherm or on BPAP or on CPAP. And 3 of them also needed invasive mechanical ventilation. And for 2 of the X-rays I show you here were of 2 of them, those which were mechanically ventilated, and they all survived the disease very well. We continue to follow up them. 1 month after the disease, they had X-ray, which you all saw. It was almost normal in all the patients. Nowadays, some of them are something like 8 months after receiving the treatment, and they are all doing very well. They have they have no respiratory symptoms, and they went back to their normal function in the daily life. So for safety purposes, we see that the medication is really safe. For efficacy points, we didn't have yet the comparative results of the patients who were only on the standard of care therapy. And I remind here that standard of care therapy, because I saw also some questions, includes, of course, respiratory support, includes steroids for patients who need hospitalization and oxygen supplementation, and includes the anticoagulants for preventing the thromboembolic events or venous thromboembolism that highly complicates these patients. So giving the medication nowadays for the patients is more than 20 patients. We give the medication, in fact, intravenously on 3 doses in 2 days apart between every 2 injections. And so, we are continuing. Continuing with. Yes, please.
No, keep going, Dr. Hamoud. Keep going.
Yes, after every 10 patients that we recruit, we are being asked to stop recruitment for patients by our Minister of Health for purposes of interim analysis that they perform. They continue to evaluate the safety of the medication. And of course, for efficacy, we are now beginning to talk about, even we still don't have an RCT for this study and for this medication. We are exactly continuing, we'll continue in the recent week to recruit patients for phase 2B of the study. And immediately we are planning to continue phase 3, which is both for safety and for efficacy purposes. We in fact intend to recruit some hundreds of patients. Meanwhile, we have the confirmation to recruit up to 80 patients in the country. And the safety study was only 1 center involved in the study, but nowadays we are going to open more centers, something like 3 centers, medical centers in Israel, in every place, in the north, in the center, and in the southern part of the country. And immediately we are beginning to plan to continue the efficacy study. And of course, it will include all the patients will receive the standard of care therapy. And we will recruit some patients, or one arm of the study will include patients with a placebo product, and the other arm on the treatment product.
That will be okay. So that's clear. And so what I'm going to do in the interest of time is just try and answer some of the questions that people have asked, because that's tremendously interesting. I'm actually going to go back to the vaccines for a moment and start off just by reiterating with you, Professor Hayek, before I ask you a question, that these patients that you treated in the trial with mesencure, that these are still patients where you would highly, highly, highly encourage vaccination in everyone. This is not an alternative to vaccination. So, this is one of the questions. But since we're talking about vaccination, can you talk a little bit about the approach in Israel to a 3rd dose of the vaccine as a booster, and how that's been going, and what the evidence looks like for that, Professor Hayek?
So first of all, the 3rd vaccination is going well, and it started with patients above 60 years old. But meanwhile, the Minister of Health decided to reduce that to 30 or 40 years old. And also, of course, medical staff in every age, especially those working in the insurance, in the Kupot Cholim, and in the hospitals, everybody is getting this vaccination. Once more, this treatment that Shadi is talking about and the other treatments of steroids and remdesivirs are not alternative for vaccination. The vaccination is the most important thing that we need to have in order to prevent this disease to be spread out in our country and all other countries. So the vaccination is the backbone of the treatment of this disease. Very important. So we are encouraging people to have the vaccination. I'm sure in Australia it's still the same. It's the same. We still have 1 million people in Israel, like 10% of the population, that don't agree to have the vaccination, no matter what you tell them. And this is very bad because this affects those patients that come to the hospital with severe disease, and they are also the source of giving the disease to others who are vaccinated, because as I said, we have vaccinated patients who have also the disease. So they do harm for themselves and for others. So still the vaccination is the most important thing. So the third dose of vaccination is going well now. And in the last actually 2 weeks, Shadi, I think, the third vaccination, we had hundreds of thousands of people who had this vaccination. And I think, but this we should be very careful that maybe, although I said we have 10,000 patients every day, that at least in the hospitals, there are still stopping the increment of the patients with severe disease. I hope that will happen, but we need for that to see in the next 2-3 weeks.
Well, we're still racing to vaccine 2. So vaccine 3 is a bit of a pipe dream still in Australia. Now, Michelle, I'm not sure if you're going to love me for this question, but we can't have a session with medical experts on COVID-19 without a question about hydroxychloroquine, because a previous president was very enthusiastic about it. And so, you know, I ask this in all seriousness, because if you're outside the medical profession, there is a lot of information and misinformation about this drug. So, and, you know, there are conspiracy theories about the suppression of information. So let me ask you just very directly, hydroxychloroquine, in your clinical experience, you know, reading, etc., have you come across any evidence that this is an effective treatment for COVID-19? And why do you think that, you know, have you had patients asking you about hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah, so hydroxychloroquine is an anti-malarial drug, a really old anti-malarial drug. And, you know, there was some interest in it as it might have some anti-coronavirus activity. Anyway, it went through a bunch of studies in real people who had COVID, and it showed no benefit at all. And so it was really, you know, from our perspective in the medical profession, it just disappeared completely off the radar. We don't even talk about it. You won't find a doctor in Australia prescribing hydroxychloroquine because it's also got side effects. And one of the things that it can do is that it can actually interfere with the electrical activity of your heart, and it can make your heartbeat kind of stretch out and then trip your heart into an arrhythmia, which can actually kill you. So we are, you know, we're not going to be prescribing it. A really good resource for people to look at is the National COVID Evidence Task Force. There's a website, I'll put it up on the chat, but this is put together by a panel of experts. They are constantly reviewing the evidence as it's coming out, and they've got some very clear statements on drugs that work and drugs that don't work. So worth checking it out, very credible.
And ML, are you know, these are the vaccines that we could make quickly, especially with respect to mRNA vaccines. I think some of the misunderstanding about mRNA vaccines is people's belief that there somehow is something inherently better about mRNA vaccines, when really one of their great advantages is the speed of development and production of these vaccines and the ability to get them out into the communities. How are you thinking about the next phase of vaccines, like the next generation of vaccines? Are you hopeful that we might see a next generation of vaccines with increased efficacy, or is that not your expectation?
Well, I think Dr. Tony and Dr. Shadi will explain to us the recent reports of the efficacy for symptomatic COVID has declined in Israel. And at one stage, we were hearing that, because don't forget, when you are testing for vaccines, you have different outcomes. You may have an outcome for severe infection, hospitalization, death, symptomatic disease, but very few of them actually ever looked at asymptomatic disease. That's far too expensive. You'd have to measure and test the participants, and each one of these drugs had, you know, tens of thousands of participants. So they really only did death, hospitalization or severe infection with hospitalization, and symptomatic disease. Now, when you have your first dose, you're protected. You have a really great reduction of risk of symptomatic disease, hospitalization, death, and it's really fantastic. But it's not until you get your second dose does the efficacy really kick in with both AstraZeneca, which we use here in Australia, and Pfizer. And Pfizer was at about 88%, that you'd have a reduced risk by 88% for symptomatic disease, and therefore you're less likely to probably develop a lot of viral load and spread it. AstraZeneca has a lower level, 67%, but it's still good. It's still great. It's better than no second dose. So please have your second dose of AstraZeneca. And I know that there are people out there who are middle-aged who haven't wanted to have their second dose because they're worried about having a clot. If you've already had your first dose, and Michelle is shaking her head, you're unlikely to have a clot after your second dose, really unlikely. Please get your second dose, because only 48% of Australians have had 2 doses of AstraZeneca or Pfizer, and only 39% of Australians between 40 and 59 have had 2 doses. It's far too few. So getting back to your question, I just thought I'd use it to sort of try and get people.
I'm always happy for any platform that encourages vaccination. So you use it as you see fit.
Ta-da. A messenger RNA is great because it's faster to produce, and therefore the likelihood of the vaccine, developers may be able to tweak it according to different strains or variants of concern. So that's what we're hoping, that this may occur. We had a meeting at WHO where China showed us their Sinovacs, and we had a presentation from Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, and all of them. And look, they're all coping with Delta quite well, and they'll all stop you from dying, and they'll all stop you from being hospitalized to a really great extent. But whether or not we'll get away with not having symptomatic disease is questionable, because results have just come out of from England looking at Pfizer in healthcare workers, because they don't use Pfizer for the general community, and also in residential aged care facility, and the efficacy has dropped. It's still great efficacy, but it's dropped from sort of 88% down to similar to AstraZeneca. So we may get a symptomatic disease. It won't be as bad. And, Dr. Tony and Dr. Shadi will tell you that in Israel, having 2 doses protects you, and you don't die. The older ones may get hospitalized because their immune system is getting tired, and Israel has shown us that at about 8 months after having your last dose plus 14 days, your neutralizing antibodies may start to wane, or I'll just do a plug. We have a great researcher at my university called Miles Davenport. He did a lovely study looking at neutralizing antibodies as a proxy for protection against disease, and looking at vaccine efficacy. And at about 90% vaccine efficacy, which none of them have anymore against symptomatic disease now that Delta has traveled around the globe, you start losing your protection at about 8 months. With AstraZeneca, we may start losing it at about 6 months. But if we do get challenged, Dr. Tony, Dr. Shadi, Michelle will all tell you that your memory T cells will start kicking in, and you'll have a better shot at having a mild case. So I'm hoping that God willing, I'm hoping that the messenger RNA will be adapted for new variants, because we're unlikely for the typical vaccine development like AstraZeneca to be able to develop it fast enough.
So I mean, the summary, the key messages you're getting out there are, don't wait for anything, get vaccinated now, get your 2 doses with whatever vaccine you can get, and hopefully there'll be tweaks to the mRNA vaccine, which has more flexibility to have quick changes, and that will enable us to stay ahead of the inevitable mutations that occur in future. And so, Dr. Hamoud, we're running out of time. I'm going to ask you my second last question, because I know that there is a nice Australian connection with a company called MGC Pharma that did something special with Rambam Hospital. So can you tell us a little bit about that very quickly?
Yes, it was one more study that we used some natural product which was produced by the MGC Pharma, an Australian pharma company. In this product, the manufacturers used natural products which included mainly vitamin C, curcumin, boswellia. Anybody heard the name? Boswellia. It's some natural product. Maybe it comes from plants or from trees. And some very ancient antibiotic, which is called artemisinin. It should be some kind of macrolide, which is not in general use in these days. But anyhow, it's a product that was given by spray to patients with COVID of any severity. It could be mild, moderate, or severe. And the treatment was also for phase 1 and 2. And in these phases, the product was much safe. In fact, people that received the product described some improvement in their feeling and maybe some relief in their dyspnea. But of course, it was only for safety purposes. The product was used for only a few days, up to 5 days. And nowadays we are exactly going to begin recruiting patients for phase 3 study, which is including also safety study, and with comparison to a placebo product. So it's also one new product.
So that's a nice connection. That's a nice Australian connection to Rambam, which is fantastic. And so I know we've only got 2 minutes left. And so, Michelle, I want to ask you this question, Dr. Michelle Ananda-rajah, and I'm going to throw the same question to Professor Tony Hayek at the end. And you have 60 seconds to answer this question, which is, for you, Michelle, what do you hope Australia looks like in 6 months' time?
Okay, in 6 months' time, I think we will start to be boosting people, and we'll have free movement within the country. And I'm hoping we'll be getting on a plane and getting out of here, traveling again. So I'm hopeful for the future. I'm concerned at the moment for New South Wales, like everyone else. I'm particularly concerned about the hospital system because, these are lean organizations, and the biggest issue is not beds or ventilators. The biggest issue is people and skilled people. So we really need to protect that workforce, really wrap it in cotton wool and do whatever it takes to protect them, because they're the ones who are going to keep us safe over the next few months. But I'm hopeful, absolutely. In 6 months' time, I think we're going to see freedom.
That's an optimistic message. And also, it's obvious that you're not a lawyer because you didn't bill me for the whole 60 seconds that I gave you an opportunity for. And Professor Hayek, why don't we finish with you? What are you hoping that Israel looks like in 6 months' time?
I hope it will be like 3 months ago, that everything was free and people went around free and traveled also to different countries without any limitations. But I'm usually optimistic, but I am not sure in this case. So we will see what will be going on. It depends really on how many people will be vaccinated and the percentage of those people. And hopefully, but that after 6 months, we'll get rid of this disease. And maybe finally we'll come and to see Australia, because it's very far from here, but we will try to do that, me and Shadi.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful way to finish this. I mean, we could have spoken for another hour. I tried to get through as many questions and weave as many in, but the level of interest here has been exactly as high as I would have expected. It was an incredibly good conversation. I thank everyone for their time and their expertise. And Vered, I'll throw back to you to close.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Adir. A wonderful, wonderful session. We would like to express our gratitude to everyone who has joined, as well as to our partner, the Israeli Embassy in Australia, Zionism Victoria, and the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, and a particular thank you to Rambam Healthcare Campus. We would like to thank Professor Tony Hayek, Professor Mary-Louise McLaws, Dr. Michelle Ananda-rajah, Dr. Shadi Hamoud, and our moderator, Mr. Adir Shiffman, for their contributions. We look forward to seeing you all on our upcoming webinar with Professor Eitan Blumenthal, Director in the Department of Ophthalmology at Rambam Healthcare Campus, who will discuss the most current development in the treatment of glaucoma and cataract. Now, to learn more about what we're doing, suggest more topics that related to health promotion, and join our Circle of Health, please don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice
See you
evening.
next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.